Hey, I'm glad y'all are here today. We're going to talk just a little bit about defending our liberty as Christians. And we just want to start off real quick. Number one is Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13 says to be in submission to the authority. It says also don't go against that authority. If you're going against that authority, that you're going against what God has established. It also says to do what is right as well. You know, our authority here in the United States is the Constitution of the United States of America. That's our highest authority. It's not the President. It's not the Secretary of State. It's not the Vice President. It's not your dog catcher. It's the Constitution. Our President, the Congress, the Senators, they make a pledge to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Our men and women make a pledge to uphold. Our men and women in uniform make a pledge to uphold the Constitution of the United States against domestic and foreign as well. And so we see that if that's our highest authority, we should be in submission to the Constitution. And so if something's coming against our Constitution, we should speak out against it. Number one is our law of the land, our highest authority, gives us that right. Number one is it gives us the right to freedom of speech. It gives us the right to protest. It gives us the right to protest in large numbers. That's called to gather together. And so to assemble, we have the right to assemble, to gather together, and to speak our minds, freedom of speech. You know, a lot of people don't want to get involved, a lot of Christians especially, because number one is they think, well, you know, I as a Christian, I really shouldn't be speaking out. That could be considered political. It could be considered going against the government. You know, Abraham in Genesis chapter 14, he went against governments. He fought against kingdoms, and he won. He went against kings and won the battle. And Moses, in Exodus chapter 2, his mother was in direct defiance against the Pharaoh, the king, the authority, the kingdom, the rulers, the government of that day. She was in direct defiance against that. Moses, in Exodus chapter 2, he was in direct defiance against the government of that day. And he came back. He killed a man. He fled. He came back, and he led the Hebrew people out, and all under God's authority while he was in defiance against the government of that day. In Joshua chapter 2, there was a lady, her name was Rahab. She was a prostitute. She was a prostitute, and she was in direct defiance against the government of her day in the city she lived in, a city called Jericho. A lot of y'all remember that. She hid some spies. God used that. In Daniel chapter 3, there was three fellows, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were in direct defiance against the king, the government of that day, and they were thrown into a fiery furnace. Remember the story about the man who got thrown into the lion's den, Daniel? In Daniel chapter 6, he got thrown into the lion's den. And because he was in direct defiance against what the king had signed a proclamation for him not to do. Many of the Old Testament prophets spoke against kings, especially when there was immorality and there were tyrants and things like that going on. In the New Testament Bible, John the Baptist spoke against King Herod because he was sexual immoral, and John knew that wasn't right. He said it wasn't right for that to be going on. The king was having his brother's wife. The apostles in Acts chapter 4 and chapter 5 got thrown into prison for doing things that the local government told them to not do anymore, the authorities of the day. And so we see that there were people going against authorities. The apostles said in Acts chapter 5 verse 29 that we must follow God, not man, rather than man. We must follow God rather than man. A lot of people don't want to, a lot of Christians don't want to speak out. Some of them because they don't quite understand that they have that right to by law. And it's okay, especially when there's immorality going on. When your tax dollars, number one is the Bible tells us to be good stewards of our money, and when our government's spending money like crazy, they're not being good stewards of our money. We elect representatives. They're supposed to represent us, and if they're representing us, who do you represent? Number one is if they're representing you, they better be representing the way you want them to. And if they're not being good stewards of your money, you have an obligation to call that person and tell them, hey, I'm not voting for you next time if you keep spending money and voting for these type of bills like that. You're bailing things out that don't need to be bailed out. You're spending money like crazy. You're not being a good steward of the American tax dollar. Not only that, American tax dollars are going to support abortion. We should stand up for that. If you're a Christian and you're not standing up for that, maybe you ought to recheck yourself and see if you are. Maybe you're scared to stand up for it. My God's not a God of timidity. He's a God of boldness. He tells us not to fear. Uh, Matter of fact, Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 9, verse 25 and 26 that what good is it if a man gains the whole world? What is it good that you gain the whole world, that you sit back in your own comfort zone and you have everything? He says, but yet you forfeit your own life. Because if you're ashamed of me and my words, I'll be ashamed of you before the Father. That's what he says. And in Matthew chapter 10, verse 33, he says, if you disown me before man, I'll disown you before the Father. Read it for yourself. Check it out. Make sure I'm telling you the truth. But our highest authority is the Constitution. We have the right to assemble. We have the right to protest. We have the right to freedom of speech. And I'm telling you what, guys, if there's immorality going on, which there is, there's men in our government right now that stand and just bold-faced lie to us, and nobody's standing up saying anything about it. There's men in our government right now that are trying to get more of our tax dollars to go and support killing unborn babies, abortion, and they calling it a choice. There's our tax dollars going to support things that we don't agree with. It's misuse of funds. They're stealing our money and calling it bailout. They're stealing our money and calling it necessity because we don't want this bank to fail or that car dealership to go out of business. The Bible tells us not to fear. We should speak out when there's things that are wrong. We're not speaking out against the authority, which is the Constitution of the United States. We are speaking out against the corruption that is going on in our country. And if we don't speak out now, you may not have an opportunity. It may be against the law for you to do that. But you know what? I'm not going to stop. I'm going to do what is right because I am not ashamed of my Lord. I am not ashamed of my belief in my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Paul said it like this in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus, for it is the power of God until salvation to all men. Read it for yourself. Read the Bible. It's good for the soul.